Well, I'm Representative Bud Nornes, and I represent District 8A, which is half of Otter Tail County. My current hometown is Fergus Falls. My real hometown is actually Beltrami, which is located up in Polk County. So I grew up there and went to school in Fertile, which is also in Polk County. But I've lived here since the mid-60s. So this is really the home that my family has known and grew up in.
So if you wanted to start kind of with your experience with rural and small communities in Minnesota, kind of where, I mean, you already spoke a little bit about where you come from.
Right.
But
well, I think that I'd have to start back in my hometown, which I often think about because, you know, growing up there, that's all you know. It was a nice town, very small. And right now currently has less than 100 residents, as I understand. But growing up there, I mean, it was so peaceful, and just a great, safe place to live. And at the same time, you don't think about, as a youngster, you don't think about the town itself and how the people that are employing people or trying to make a living there, you know, how they're doing that. And it must have been a struggle, because my hometown had gone from being, in the early days, a real bustling community, a real thriving community with everything from a stockyard for loading cattle on the train, and banks and hotels, implement dealers, obviously the elevators, gas stations, saloons. It goes on and on. But when I grew up, it only had, you know, a little store left and a place to fix your cars and a small cafe. And so it had really gone down. But until you study what the town had once been, as you're growing up there, you think, well, that's just the way it's always been. And so I feel my small town, that experience of growing up there has really helped me to understand what's going on in rural Minnesota. And the decline that we see in some communities is really sad, and that bothers me very much.
Great. So if you could kind of expand on those issues and what the biggest issue you think facing rural Minnesotan communities are, and the individuals that live there. You don't have to pick one issue. But
right. Well, it's complicated. Mm-hmm. You know, where I grew up in here around Fergus Falls, it's agriculture. That's a very big part of this economy, and a good. I mean, you talk about having a solid foundation as far as economics is concerned. That's always been there, even though they've had good and bad times. But the change in agriculture has been more difficult for the small towns than it has for Fergus Falls, as an example, because farms have gotten bigger. Families have been. There aren't as many farm families because of that. Families themselves have gotten smaller. But the type of farming and that impact on the small towns in particular, I think, has been really dramatic. And there's no way to reverse that as far as I can tell, because when you have fewer people, it just naturally leads to economic problems for those that are depending on services and purchases by those folks.
So then, how does that, and how would you describe the rural narrative? So what is the story behind rural Minnesotan communities?
Well, I think the communities in my district all are proud of what they have and what they're doing today and how they're surviving. I think that they're all finding ways to do that, and if they're not the home of a lot of jobs, they are homes for a lot of people who choose to live there, and a lot of them see that as their future, I think. So they're upgrading their water and sewer and some of those basic things, making it an attractive place to live, although they may have to commute to a job somewhere. And in some cases, there's also another avenue that some have been able to take advantage of, and that is to work at home. So even though their employer might be somewhere else, quite a ways away, in fact, they could be living in one of these small communities and have a very good job, but never have to leave the home. And right now, there's a lot of people that are taking advantage of that. This area is very unique because it's not only agriculture, like you talked about, but it has more lakes than any other county in the state of Minnesota. Over 1,000 lakes just in this one county. 10% of Minnesota lakes are here in Otter Tail County. So a lot of people choose to live near those, and some of our communities are right on the edge of lakes. Battle Lake is an example. Fergus is another town. You can go to Otter Tail City. So you can live in these small towns and have absolutely the best life in the world with recreation and a good job. So I mean, that's just something that small towns in rural Minnesota now, I think, are seeing as a new, brighter future. Yeah.
So then how does immigration and emigration from rural communities affect them? So kind of that flow of people leaving or coming back or whatever that exchange may be. And are these issues currently present in rural communities? How are these issues manifesting in communities if they are? I'm
not 100% clear on what you're saying about immigration. Or are you talking about people moving in or moving out, right, basically? Mm-hmm. I think we're pretty stable. I don't think we have large numbers of people leaving. We haven't had any major job losses. In some ways, we're fortunate there not have a large employer that decides to leave and go somewhere else. So that part of it is pretty stable, and that's where you'd have maybe a mass exodus of people. So because we're pretty stable, housing is pretty stable. People coming, moving in, moving out. It's just normal. At the same time, because of really a problem employers are having with finding employees, there are some efforts right now to find people to move here to this area. Not necessarily just Fergus Falls, but Perham and other communities where they have jobs, but they don't have enough people. So they're looking to find folks that they can attract, and I know Perham is actively involved in that. Pelican Rapids has done that to operate their turkey plant. They've got more nationalities in that community than even the Twin Cities may. I don't know if you can find more diversification than what Pelican Rapids has. So that's the part, I think. So it's not the out. I don't think we're losing people. We do in the wintertime. It gets cold and some people are able to leave and find a warmer spot. But that's just temporary. They come back, So I think we're lucky, at least in this area, to have what I'd say pretty normal in and out of people coming and going.
So what are the similarities and differences that you see between the needs of rural and urban areas? So in terms of policy that might be made or kind of hands-on work, what are the key differences that you see coming out?
Well, I think that we're always at a disadvantage in greater Minnesota for two things. We have less representation, and that's just a fact of life. There are more votes on any issue in the Twin Cities area than out here. So right away we're outnumbered. The other thing is, because of the size of the Twin Cities, the amount of jobs down there, they just naturally grow pretty much on their own. Out here it's more difficult. So as a representative, what we try to explain to those folks is that it's not enough to just say, well, we'll go 50-50 on something. We'll give you half, we'll give you half. It's more, we need more rather than less in order to be even fair. And I think an example of that is in the last legislative session, we were talking about expanding broadband, and that was targeted primarily to greater Minnesota, where in some cases there is none, it doesn't exist. But all over the Twin Cities and the metro area, it's taken for granted. And if they want it, they can get it. But we don't have that out in this part of the country. Some places have it, but many don't. And that goes back to what I talked earlier about being able to work from home. You need the tools to do that. And so that legislation, although not as much as probably is even close to what the need is a step in the right direction to help us to keep up, or at least even begin to keep up with the metro area.
Yeah, that's really good that you bring that up. We hear that a lot about broadband being kind of one of these
Right.
key issues in terms of...
Imagine trying to run a business or operate with dial-up.
Yeah.
You can't do it.
Not today.
Not today, no.
So then, I think you kind of touched on this, but what kind of policy changes do you think would positively impact rural Minnesota, and what changes are you interested in making or seeing made to support small towns? So if you could kind of create any policies, what
Sure.
would be most beneficial?
Well, I would actually like to undo some policies that we already have. And I think, in my opinion, the minimum wage is not a good thing, again, for rural Minnesota. We have small business struggling in the first place. And now here comes the government telling you got to pay your employees more, even though you don't have the capacity to do that. So you do what you have to do, which probably is have fewer employees. And as I travel around Minnesota and through the small towns, and you see building after building empty for sale or lease or nothing going on, my immediate thought is that those folks didn't leave because they got rich. They closed the business because it wasn't viable anymore. So the policy has to be, what can we do to help these people? And what can we do to take the burden off? Just like we did with agriculture back when they were having a lot of trouble in the 80s. What did the state do? The only thing they could do. They took some of the costs of operating business away. Sales tax on machinery is an example. We did that so that their overhead would be less. So those kind of things I think we have to look at for rural Minnesota too. Instead of piling on more costs. And another way we can help them, we talked earlier about water and sewer in some of these small towns. The government needs to do as much as we can to help offset the cost of that. Because again, it's very expensive, and to expect the local community to have enough tax capacity to pay that without discouraging people from moving there, I think is another important thing. So the list isn't that long. It's kind of basic on just providing the fundamentals.
Okay. So I think this is another thing we kind of touched on, but I'd love to hear you elaborate. And what do you see as the future for small towns? Where would you like to see them, specifically the ones kind of in your area and in your district, in 15 to 20 years? And what changes do you think are necessary to make this a reality? I think you touched on parts of this.
Well, I don't know if I can. That's a real good question, and one that's hard to answer. The communities that I have in my district, for example, I think are all going to be here. You can drive down a few towns and a few roads, and you'll find just the sign of some towns that are gone completely. But those that are here, I think, are going to be doing well. What I'd like to see, and I think this is happening now, is a working relationship between all of those communities. And in this area, we're lucky because the mayors have kind of I guess, an unorganized organization where they just get together once a month, very informally. And they talk about various things that are affecting each community. They have ideas that might help another and so forth. So they're starting to work together in that way. And I think they even occasionally bring up, jobs and so forth. And Fergus Falls, the larger community, the largest one here, and Perham, the next largest, are all involved in that. And very willing to help any way they can to, just as an example, we had a small business in Elizabeth that started in the old creamery. Hats off to people that have a dream. They find a place that's been empty. They find a way to utilize it. It's very affordable. They have now upgraded to a larger building here in Fergus Falls, which means that their business now is really a successful one, growing, and needed more space, and here they are. And we need to see as much of that as we can, where they can start somewhere and grow. But again, working together, I think, is the key. Again, here it's primarily just Otter Tail County. We have Elbow Lake in Grant County, Ashby in Grant County, that are a part of this, and I think they welcome others too, perhaps, although some of the cafes aren't big enough to handle as many mayors as potentially could show up. But every month they alternate to a different town, and so they each get to host one of those little meetings. So, but I think that's what I see happening. State government, I mean, we can be involved and help in any way we can, but I think these towns working together and not seeing each other as a competitor is really a positive thing.
I think that's a really cool and interesting answer, and I love the fact that the mayors all get together.
Yeah, and I get to go too. Yeah.
So kind of finally, and to close, do you have any messages or remarks for rural developers and leaders? This can be anybody from people working at kind of rural partnerships, in business, in agriculture, kind of these people that are stepping forward to lead. Right. What would you say or recommend to them? Well,
number one, I would like to hear from as many as possible with their ideas and what the legislature itself can do. I oppose the increase in minimum wage this past session with those folks in mind, because when someone is looking at your community to begin a business, expand a business, whatever it might be, there's two things they look at. One is the availability of workers and the cost of operating. So what is the labor cost in this community or in this state compared to this other state? And often that's the deciding factor. And you could have other incentives. State had a few of those that have now gone away again, but primarily, what are the things that we can do so that if somebody is looking at North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Minnesota, how can these people that are out there, that's their job to create jobs, how can they compete? What is the best tool that the state can provide, for example? So to answer your question, I would like to hear as many of those folks contact me or anyone else with ideas and outline the problems that they really face on a day-to-day basis. And here in Fergus Falls, I've got a good working relationship with the economic development folks, and they do that. But I'd like to expand that to other communities who happen to see this, invite them to contact me too.
Great. That's kind of the last of my questions, but if you have anything else you'd like to add or expand on, you're welcome to do that as well.
I think we've probably covered it, except that, it's good to be able to sit down and think about some of these issues, because then all of a sudden, at least it's out there, hopefully address the issues then that, go back to my hometown just for a second. I talked about the town that I lived in and how it had kind of gone downhill. It even had a movie theater at one time and a lumberyard. I could go on. But it went downhill, and some years ago they built a mall. They actually leveled the whole town except for 2 buildings, I think, and built a nice mall. Everybody was excited. This mall had a cafe, it had a post office, it had a hardware store, it had a beauty salon, had a gas station, a repair shop. I'm forgetting something, but it was in a small town, nice little mall. And not all worked out. It even had a place where they manufactured fishing lures. So back up to this past spring, the building burns down. Now the whole town is gone, with the exception of the big elevators that are still there, holding millions and millions of tons of bushels of grain and stuff. But the town is basically gone. And to go back home now, there will be an office building built, I guess, to house the people that work at the elevator, but there will be no gas station. There will be no post office. There will be no cafe. And that's really sad. I teased my brother. I said, we need to go back and build a cafe, as a tribute to our community. But it'd be risky to do that. But I mean, that's an unfortunate thing that really has really kind of put the cap on my hometown.